Hello, my friends. Today we're going to be painting a Christmas wreath. In this tutorial, we're going to explore creating some texture with salt once again. So how salt works is that each granulation of salt acts as basically like a tiny sponge, pulling the water and whatever pigment it is with towards that grain of salt. So the effect will depend on a few factors, including the size and shape of the salt grain. So different types of salt will produce different effects. The pattern in which the salt landed, the type of pigment it landed into, and the wetness of the paper. So experimenting with all these different factors will essentially result in different results. So in this painting, I have chosen about 4 shades of green. A bright green gold, which has a lot of yellow in it, and as my base. And then I add basically shades of blue and purple into my greens to kind of desaturate them and darken them. And so I'm going to leave the final shades of greens up to you. Do some mixing and some experimenting. You just want a little bit of variation so that the final piece has a bit of dimension to it. Now, how I'm painting this is each leaf is going to go down directly onto the dry paper, and choosing which color goes where is going to be up to you. So keep it loose, try to use your intuition. And on many of the leaves, once I put down the base pigment, I went over top of the wet paint and put a darker shade at the base of the leaf. And this technique is called the wet on wet painting technique. And it's exactly how it sounds, painting directly on top of the wet paint without allowing the lower layer to dry. And this creates a fluid and fun, unpredictable effect. There's a less control with using a wet on wet technique, but you'll see the paint kind of flows into the wet area and it gives a very natural effect. Now, as I complete each leaf, I sprinkle salt over that area that I've just painted, and then I continue on to the next leaf and continue doing this process until the entire wreath is complete. And there's no need to worry about wet pigment pooling onto another section in this painting. Usually in these tutorials, I kind of caution against when we're painting one area, especially when there's very contrasting colors that potentially will just create like a muddy, gross color that we don't want. If you say you're painting like a bright area up against a dark area, you really don't want to touch those pigments, don't want to touch, because they're going to pool into one another. In this case, it doesn't matter. We're going to embrace the chaos with this painting and let the paint mix into one another. Because they're all shades of green, there's no real threat of creating some kind of gross colors and just observe the effect and watch what the water does when it pulls into each other. And another tip on doing the wet on wet technique I forgot to mention earlier is that you want thick paper, enough tooth and texture in the paper itself to absorb that water so that the paper doesn't buckle and shred with the heavy application of water. And so I prefer to use cold press paper, especially if you're doing a lot of wet on wet techniques with a lot of water. Hot press is not that absorbent, and it's really good for doing a lot of details, but not so good for that kind of loose painting technique, because hot press paper is more smooth and uniform type of paper. And if you'd like me to go more in depth on the differences between cold press and hot press paper, let me know and I'll make a video on it. Now you're going to want to let your paint dry completely before taking off the salt. So keep on painting the entire wreath, putting the salt on, and then wait until it dries bone dry. You can do the process. I like to basically let the salt do its natural texturizing of the paper for about 10 to 15 minutes. And in that time, you should have a sufficient enough drying time that you can go over it with a hair dryer at the end, just to kind of ensure that is no more wet pigment. Otherwise, if you take it off while it's still wet, you have a greater chance of just smearing paint over your paper, and I've done that plenty of times, trust me. Moving on to the little berries at the bottom, you're going to want to mix 2 shades of red, a bright kind of fire truck red, and then a shade color that goes on the bottom. And to create the shade color, you can add a little tiny bit of black, or you can add some blue or purple, just a contrasting color to darken that shadow area up. And I don't know if you can see, but I left a little tiny white spot at the top of each berry, just to kind of signify a highlight in that area. And then I just painted around that white spot with the base, that fire truck red. And then I went directly on the wet paint and kind of created that shadow on the underside of the berry. And if you want to blend those 2 colors, you're going to want to clean your brush and wipe all the excess water off. And where those 2 colors meet, you can go over it with that dry brush, and you should be able to kind of like blend those 2 colors together to have more of a uniform feel. If that's not your thing, then just leave it how it is. And I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I'm going to do another one for November, so watch out for that. And I've had a request for a golden retriever, so that's going to be up on the blocks as well. And if you have a special request you'd like to see for a tutorial, let me know and I will make it happen for you guys.